Today's lecture by Mr. Alessandro De Pedis is one of the series of lectures by famous diplomats in Hong Kong, including that from the mainland China, USA, UK, Germany, France, Korea, Japan, and the United Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Today's lecture is well received by members of the consulates, local, mainland, overseas, and exchange students and teachers of the Chinese University. May I now invite Professor Lawrence Lau, Vice Chancellor of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, to give his welcoming address. Professor Lau, please.
Mr. De Pedis, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all and welcome to the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today, we are most honored and privileged to have with us as our distinguished speaker, Mr. Alessandro De Pedis, Consul General of Italy in Hong Kong and Macau, who is going to speak to us on Europe and Asia, challenges for the 21st century. We're extremely grateful to him for making the time to share with our faculty and students his wisdom and wealth of experience. Thank you very much. Mr. De Pedis graduated from the University of Rome in 1986 and joined the Italian Foreign Service in 1989. In 1992, he was posted to Korea to serve as head of the economics department in the Italian embassy in Seoul. He became first secretary at the Italian embassy in London in 1996 and was promoted to consular in 1999. Returning to Rome in 2000, Mr. De Pedis was put in charge of press and political affairs in the Information Services Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was subsequently appointed in 2002 as Deputy Chief of Delegation of the Italian Presidency of the European Union. From 2004 onwards until early 2007, Mr. De Pedis served in the office of the Diplomatic Counselor of the President and had accompanied the Italian President and the Prime Minister respectively on their visits to China in 2004 and 2006. He assumed the post of Consul General in Hong Kong, Macau last February. A veteran diplomat, Mr. De Pedis has worked in Europe and Asia for almost 20 years and is thoroughly conversant with the evolution of Italian foreign policy on both continents. We are very privileged indeed to have him here today to speak to us on the challenges facing Europe and Asia in the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you can't wait to be inspired by his insights and rich experience, so please join me in warmly welcoming Consul General De Pedis.
Dear Vice Chancellor, dear students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I see from your program that I have an allotted time of 15 minutes to talk to you, but I think I will speak for about 25, 30 minutes, less than 50. And that way I will give my personal contribution to the fight against global warming by releasing a smaller quantity of hot air into the atmosphere. But first of all, let me express my sincere thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk at this prestigious university. It is indeed a pleasure to share my opinions with you, and I will be glad to answer questions that may arise from my presentation, provided we have enough time. Before we start, I would like to clarify that I'm not an expert in European affairs, meaning that I'm not that familiar with the technicalities of the process of European integration, which is quite complicated. Some of my colleagues in the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as in all the ministries of foreign affairs all across Europe, have been studying those aspects for years, and they really know the nuts and bolts of the European Union's mechanism. But this is definitely not my case. And here, you might know that here in Hong Kong there is a representative of the Commission, who is a good friend, Thomas Rowe, and he's the expert in these matters. And I normally defer to him, and I suggest to you do the same whenever you need reliable advice on the EU machinery. That said, I decided to make Europe and not Italy the subject of today's meeting. Europe and its relationship with Asia. Therefore, I will not talk specifically about Italy, nor will I talk about Hong Kong. There are more than one reason for this choice, but the main reason is that I'm personally convinced that the two most important, momentous developments in international relations in the last 50 years are the birth of an integrated Europe and the re-emergence of Asia as a protagonist on the world stage. The European experiment is by all means without precedent. It has created a new entity, an economic giant, the global responsibilities, as we will see later on. Well, as in the case of Asia, I use the word re-emergence and not emergence on purpose, because Asia has been a key player in cultural, economic, and political terms for the greatest part of recorded history. According to some recent studies, at the time when the Roman Empire was approaching its prime, Western Europe accounted for less than 14% of the world GDP, against 57% of China and India combined. Now, don't ask me how to make these calculations, because I don't know, but there it is. And this situation didn't change for a full millennium and a half. So only the scientific discoveries of the 17th and 18th century, and subsequently the Industrial Revolution, projected Europe and then America to new heights, while Asia lost temporarily its primacy. So your continent is now regaining its previous position and redefining its role and its relationship with the rest of the world. And the way it will interact with Europe, in particular, is, to me, a matter of considerable importance, and hence the title of today's lecture. Europe and Asia have, of course, interacted in the past, and indeed our relationship dates back to very ancient times. I mentioned before the Roman Empire. Well, the Romans traded regularly, although indirectly, with the Chinese Empire during the Han Dynasty. And in the 1st century AD, a guy called Plinius the Old, a Roman naturalist, used to complain that the imports of silk from China were corrupting the virtues and the habits of Roman women. So it is indeed an old relationship. Now, contacts were interrupted after the Islamic conquests and were only resumed in the aftermath of the Mongol invasion. Italian explorers, soldiers, merchants, diplomats, and missionaries played in those days a leading role in creating a bond between our two continents. I do not need to remind you of the names of Marco Polo and Matteo Ricci, but theirs are the only European names engraved in the central hall of the China Millennium Monument in Beijing, a monument that documents the story of the Chinese people. And there are, of course, many more that blaze the trail between Europe and Asia. Many centuries later, other European countries, so not Italy anymore, took the lead in dealing with Asia in much more aggressive ways, with rather unpleasant results, I have to say. Although I have to admit that the birth of Hong Kong is a positive, unexpected outcome of these aggressive policies. But anyway, that was then, this is now. And what I would like to do is to share with you a few thoughts on the origins of the European construction, on its impact and significance, and then proceed to some considerations on how Asia could benefit from the European experience and on how our two continents can relate to each other. My approach to these issues will be, for once, political rather than economic. The importance and the magnitude of our economic relationship is well known. We do not need to discuss it today unless you want to talk about it when we pass to the Q&A stage. So when we consider European integration, it is important to look for the roots of what we call Europe, to search for the concept of Europe, because its trait and profile are essential elements to understand the ideal foundation on which the task of unifying Europe is built. Because Europe is, first and foremost, an idea. It is an idea which took form little by little in the midst of the turmoil and tragedies of our history. And as Europeans, we are profoundly aware of the dark aspects of our past. European nations have bitterly fought each other for centuries before directing their aggressiveness toward other continents. And yet, amid the conflicts and the bloodshed, a common European culture slowly emerged. But in fact, the history of Europe is not only a history of violence. Besides the various attempts to unify the continent through force, there have been important community experiences, such as the establishment of a Christian community in the Middle Ages, or the Age of Enlightenment, which define our modern way of thinking. And out of these many common experiences, and we look here at a fresco that includes ancient Greece and the Roman Empire, Charles the Great and the Renaissance, a set of traditions, ideas, and aspirations grew. These traditions, ideas, and aspirations are what make us Europeans. Our common European culture is our source of unity, and it is the glue that keeps us together. So it took, however, the self-destroying madness of 2 world wars that brought the continent to the brink of annihilation to really kickstart the process of European integration. While the Second World War was still raging, a French statesman called Jean Monnet voiced the belief that no peace could exist in Europe if national states were to be rebuilt on the basis of the old sovereignty concept. The same belief was behind the work of 2 Italian intellectuals, Altiero Spinelli and Ernesto Rossi, who in 1941 wrote a manifesto containing a federalist program aimed at preventing extreme nationalist ideologies from provoking further disasters. Now, after the war, those who were left standing among the ruins vowed that never again would the people of Europe take arms against each other. They decided that Europe should become one, a Europe capable of integration, a continent at once single and many, rich in diversity, conscious of its common heritage and civilization, and strong in combining cooperation between national governments with the new supranational dimension. In the early 50s, the first bricks of European constructions were laid. First, the establishment of the European Coal and Steel Committee in 1951. Then, on the 25th of March, 1957, the Treaties of Rome were finally signed. Last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of that signature. It was the start of a long process that, step by step, was to lead the continent towards ever closer integration to the single currency and further. It is still an ongoing process. The most recent achievement has been the signature, less than 2 months ago in December, of the Treaty of Lisbon. This was a necessary step. With the number of member states substantially increased, the decision-making process within European institutions had become complicated. Efficiency had suffered, and disillusionment had set in. Only a new leap forward could rejuvenate and inject new energy in the European body. So basically, this is what the Lisbon Treaty does. It oils the gears of our institutions and makes our external action more effective. I'll give you briefly a few hints on what it is about. The new provisions change the European Union's voting system, which will become simpler and more reflective of each nation's population size. They expand the fields where majority voting will be the rule, a unanimity no longer necessary, and they create a full-time standing president of the European Council, who would serve 2.5 years. The treaty introduces a new foreign minister in all but name, who will work for both national governments and the European Commission. And under the treaty, the keenest member states may push ahead, if they want, with defense cooperation among themselves. The treaty also gives legal force to the Charter of Fundamental Rights, further consolidating the range of freedoms and individual rights that European citizens already enjoy. And finally, it shrinks the European Commission's top layer of political leaders, making it more agile, and strengthens the power of the European Parliament and of national parliaments, making the whole decision-making process more inclusive and democratic. So the European idea is, in my opinion, the only surviving ideology of the 20th century. And you know why? Because unlike other ideas, it has successfully been turned into practice, because it has succeeded. Half a century of ever closer union has brought about unprecedented prosperity, peace, and democracy. The experiment has been so successful that its results are often taken for granted, especially by young people, people as young as you, who have no memory of a divided, fragile, dangerous Europe. It has also worked as a magnet for all other European countries. With over 500 million people, second in terms of population only to China and India, the European Union stretches from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. We started at 6, we are now 27. Bulgaria and Romania were the last to join the family in January 2007. Croatia, Macedonia, and Turkey have presented the candidature, and Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and Montenegro may follow. But we don't live in a glass cage. We know that we are not alone in the world. So Europe is not an inward-looking entity. Europe is on the stage, and Europeans feel their responsibility. This is why the EU is not just an economic powerhouse. On the contrary, it plays a significant role in world affairs, although sometimes not a very visible one. Our soldiers patrol the streets of distant countries plagued by war and civil unrest. In Bosnia and Palestine, we are this very day starting a major military operation in Chad and Central Africa to protect the Darfur refugees. Our law enforcement agencies contribute to the war against terror. Our policymakers are frontrunners in the race for a better environment. And we are the largest provider of development and emergency aid. But most of all, however, it is our capacity to keep together many different countries and nationalities, and to include them into a system which guarantees peace and wealth altogether, that appeals to all those who are on the outside looking in, even here in faraway Asia. Today, we meet Hong Kong, in the heart of the most economically dynamic area of the world, the Asia-Pacific. This is the region which has most benefited from the globalization process that reached a momentum in the last couple of decades. The scale and the pace of growth, spearheaded by the growth of China, is impressive. China and Japan already produce almost 1/4 of the world GDP, without taking India, Korea, Indonesia, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand into the picture. In 30 years, 3 out of 4 of the world's biggest economies will be Asian. 30 years. A time span that may look huge to young students, but in historical terms, it's just a blink of an eye. And look what is happening in the financial field. Only 10 years ago, economists in Europe and America worried about insolvency in Moscow, Mexico City, and Buenos Aires, about the crash of the stock exchange in Seoul, in Bangkok, in Tokyo. Today, it is Asia and the so-called emerging countries that are affected by faraway crisis. It is them that import instability from the West. Once upon a time, it was Europe, the United States, and the International Monetary Fund that organized financial rescue operations when a financial crisis loomed in Asia or Latin America. Today, we face an international credit crunch because of a crisis, subprime mortgage crisis, originated in the United States, the most advanced economy in the world. And we look to Asia and to China in particular to provide the demand, to provide liquidity into the global financial system. 10 years after the Asian financial crisis, 7 out of 10 of the largest currency reserve holders belong to this region. This is quite a change in just 10 years' time. So people in Asia are now enjoying a level of prosperity almost unthinkable before. Not only Hong Kong and Tokyo, but also Jakarta, Mumbai, Shanghai, Kuala Lumpur are world-class metropolitan areas. Standards of living are growing, and Asian businessmen roam the planet in search of new business opportunities. Asian products are common in shops in Italy, as well as in the rest of Europe. And what we import from Asia is no longer cheap and labor-intensive. We now buy products that are endowed with cutting-edge technology and precious design. African heads of states gather in Beijing. Latin American entrepreneurs flock to Shanghai and New Delhi to sign new deals. The petrodollars of the Persian Gulf end up ever more often in the pockets of Chinese, Japanese, or Korean construction companies. So things on the whole are looking good, and the future looks bright. But I would say that things are never as rosy as they seem, and this is where I would like to introduce a note of caution. I want to point out that booming trade and economic growth by themselves do not guarantee prosperity and peace. The European experience is quite clear. Trade was never so florid among the European nations as in the years before World War I, and we all know what happened afterwards. So in spite of its fast economic development, Asia has to face major challenges, and its future will depend on how these challenges will be addressed. Competition for scarce natural resources, environmental degradation, social tensions arising from the growing imbalance between the rich and the poor and between rural and urban areas, ethnic and religious strife, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, massive violations of human rights, contending nationalisms steeped in ancient rivalries, to name only a few. The fault lines are some of the world's most dangerous crises run through the Asian continent. A dormant state of war on the Korean Peninsula, tension in the Taiwan Strait, a nuclear standoff on the Indian subcontinent, a fragmented Afghanistan, resumed civil war in Sri Lanka, repression in Myanmar, terrorism in the Philippines, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Thailand, rival territorial claims in the Sea of Japan, in the South China Sea, in Kashmir, in the Himalaya. These are all very serious situations that in a global environment are of great concern to everyone, because when they get out of hand, they affect all of us. So I think that the European experience can be of value here. We learned the hard way that dialogue and patience are the only way to solve such problems peacefully. And through a close integration of our societies, we have made war among the European nations a factual impossibility. Europe and Asia have, of course, evolved in different ways. And I'm not as naive as to suggest that Asia should move along the same path of the European Union. I do think, however, that regional integration can foster dialogue and the peaceful resolution of controversies, while at the same time making the possibility of violent deflagrations more remote. The growing interdependence among Asian economies is the result of trade, investment, and capital flows. And it has raised the awareness that Asian nations also need to strengthen cooperation in various fields. Progress was made especially in the aftermath of the economic crisis in the late 90s, and the number of new free trade agreements was signed. So regionalization in Asia has been market-led, and the various discussion fora that were created starting from the early 80s have yet to take a decisive step towards embracing the political dimension. The oldest and best known regional organization is ASEAN, where the 5 founding nations have managed to attract others and are now holding meetings and summits also with the 3 giants of the continent, China, Japan, and India. ASEAN has indeed been one of the many factors that have favored the economic growth of Southeast Asia. And various efforts are being made by Asian countries at finding ways to discuss Asian affairs. New fora are born, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the East Asian Summit, and so on. Well, I mentioned earlier the 50th anniversary of the Treaties of Rome, which we celebrated in 2007. But last year marked another important celebration, the 40th anniversary of the creation of ASEAN. Now, I do not believe coincidences always carry a meaning, but in this case I might make an exception. But more significant than coincidences are facts. An important fact is that since 1996, representatives of our two continents have informally started to meet once every 2 years to discuss strategic issues. ASEM, which means the Asian-Europe meeting, has become an important appointment every 2 years and an effective platform for policy involvement. In 2006, the ASEM summit attracted 39 countries from both continents. Participation in ASEM 2008 will grow even more, to 45 partners or more. And the summit will be held in Beijing, an evocative choice. Not only is the city the capital of China, but it is also located at one end of the ancient Silk Road. It was the old path merchants from our two continents followed in their adventurous travels. Probably the pioneers of the Silk Road could not imagine how, in the following centuries, Asia and Europe were going to shape each other. Nevertheless, they paved the road on which the flow of people, goods, and knowledge has continued for centuries. So the EU is nowadays the first trading partner for China, and its trade relationship with most Asian countries follows the same pattern. Now, I do not need to elaborate, as I said from the beginning, on the volume of bilateral trade and on the importance of the flow of investments, because we are all fully aware of that. But the level of political reciprocal involvement does not even begin to match the depth of the economic relationship. ASEM is a first gallant effort at comprehensive cooperation, but it is still in a very preliminary stage. Our relationship, therefore, is an unbalanced relationship. And it is something that we have to address. The issues that Asia has to tackle, security, energy, climate change, are global issues. We are all stakeholders, all of us, you, me, everybody. If we confine our dialogue to quotas, tariffs, and dumping policies, important as they are, we are only pushing other problems under the carpet. We are only deluding ourselves, and sooner or later tensions will arise. It is already happening. Since we are in China, let us mention the EU-China relationship, which is a very fitting example of what I mean. This relationship has always been considered ideal, mainly because the Chinese side tended to favor European soft-spoken diplomacy to the more muscular American approach. The relationship is still excellent, but increasingly problems are emerging. The last EU-China summit, last November, has been less successful than expected, less successful than previous summits. And the negotiations for the new partnership and cooperation agreement have been dragging their feet for some time now. A number of issues have come to the fore, seemingly at the same time: trade imbalance, undervaluation of the renminbi, food safety, import safety, intellectual property rights, but also the problem of the arms embargo, the support to repressive regimes, the arms race, human rights, and so on. So why is that? I like to think that we are now moving into a more mature relationship, when the infatuation is gone and the time comes to address the real problems. Young lovers only see the good sides of each other and choose to ignore the shortcomings. But after some time, mutual understanding, trust, and confidence become more important than before. We see more of each other, we interact much more than before, and therefore more problems arise and we can no longer ignore them. When conflicting interests and opportunities coexist, a capacity for dialogue is the only way forward. Asian countries, in general, have so far behaved as if Asian problems were their own exclusive concern and should stay that way, an exception being made for historical reasons for the United States. They seem to think that Europe does not have much to offer on the political side, as a provider of global security, for example, and therefore have always preferred to stick to the economic agenda in dealing with us. This is a mistake. We are no longer just a trading partner. We realize that our peculiar institutional system makes it sometimes difficult for a counterpart to understand how to work with us. But even though we may not be the most straightforward of international partners, we certainly are one of the most influential. As I said before, the issues at stake are global, and Europe is a global player. So is Asia, and increasingly, Asian people are realizing that sharing in global prosperity also means sharing responsibility for global peace and development. We offer to shoulder those responsibilities together. We offer a modern partnership between Europe and Asia based on cooperation, mutual respect, transparency, and the pursuit of shared goals. International terrorism, transnational crimes, illegal immigration, conflict prevention, non-proliferation, disarmament, peacekeeping. These are just a few examples of the fields where a strong Euro-Asian cooperation could make a difference. But you could also add the fight against pandemic disease, the strengthening of the institutions of global governance, such as the United Nations and WTO, the effort in favor of an efficient rules-based multilateralism, the responsible handling of non-renewable natural resources, the fight against climate change, and so on. I could continue, but I think the point is clear. A solid, integrated, successful Europe is an ideal partner for the Asian nations that now step with new confidence on the international stage, provided they do not repeat their mistakes or our mistakes. It took a long time for us Europeans to get to the point where our problems are solved solely through dialogue and patient negotiation. Before we learned to do that, we drowned our own continent and the rest of the world in blood and almost destroyed our own civilization. But we have learned our lesson. And today we look at our diversities as an enrichment rather than a source of conflict. I do hope that you can learn from both our mistakes and our successes. Now allow me to conclude with a quotation from the manifesto of Altiero Spinelli and Ernesto Rossi, the two Italian intellectuals I mentioned before. Don't forget that Italy has always been at the forefront of European integration. It was one of the original 6 founding members, and has always been among those in favor of strengthening political, not just economic, cooperation among the countries of Europe. This quotation from the manifesto is quite visionary, especially if you think that it was written among the carnage of the Second World War by people forcibly confined on a small island in the Mediterranean Sea. And it goes like that. Once the horizon of the old continent of Europe is passed beyond, and all the people who make humanity join together for a common plan, it will have to be recognized that the European Federation is the only conceivable guarantee that relationships with American and Asian people can exist on the basis of peaceful cooperation, while awaiting a more distant future when the political unity of the entire globe becomes a possibility. This was written in Ventotene in 1941. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. De Pedis, for your most inspiring lecture. Ringraziamo tanto, Signore De Pedis. Mr. De Pedis has kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience. Now, may I invite Professor Lawrence Lau to conduct the question and answer session, please.
Thank you very much. Let us give another hand to the Consul General for a great speech. The ground rules are you identify yourself, raise your hand, and try to keep the question relatively simple. Yeah. Floor is open. Please.
I'm interested in the Islamic world. So I just want to ask a simple question, but it's difficult to deal with, I think. It's how we cope with or accommodate the Islamic culture in both Europe and Asia.
Well, this is a $100 million question. I mean, it's, Europe has a growing population of coming from Islamic countries, and there are indeed problems. I think that in the end, what you need is a balance between the need to welcome these people and the need for these people coming to our countries to respect our laws. Sometimes the approach is not that balanced. Sometimes we open the door, we do not expect them to, we offer integration, but this integration must be based on the respect of our laws. So on the one hand, but I understand it is very difficult because the customs are so diverging, but in the end, I think if you're moving to somebody else's country, it is up to you to do your best to integrate and first of all to respect the law. Italy is a country which has, now it's a country which is an object of immigration, but traditionally we always have been exporting people. We have millions of people abroad of Italian origin, so we know what it means to have our people going abroad and being discriminated, being mistreated and so on. Therefore, we are a tolerant country, and most of the countries of Europe are, I think. But this tolerance must be, I think, coupled with the idea that we have our laws and these laws are to be respected. It's bilateral. I mean, you cannot expect the countries of Europe or the countries of Asia to solve the problems just by themselves. I mean, the immigrants must also make an effort, in my view. It goes both ways.
Thank you. Next question. Please.
Frank.
I mentioned that Turkey is applying for membership in the EU, and Turkey sometimes is not thought of as being a European country. Can you imagine Russia being accepted into the ranks of Europe?
Well, not for the moment. We mentioned Turkey. In fact, Turkey is not yet a member of the European Union, precisely, I think, because it is basically, most of its population is non-European origin. This doesn't mean that you cannot welcome them into the European Union, but it means that the problems are much bigger. The problems to solve are much bigger. If we have such a problem with Turkey, which is, I think, about 18 million people, I'm not sure how many, imagine taking a country like Russia, which has part of the population is, of course, of European origin, but the rest of it is not, and maybe 70% of its landmass is outside Europe. For the moment, I think there are no plans for something like that, and such a move will completely change the identity and the character of the European Union. So I don't see it coming. Don't quote me on that, but I don't see it coming in the foreseeable future. In the end, Turkey is originally a non-European country, but still it will be one country among a number of other countries, and it will not change the balances, but Russia is something quite different. It will be a very different Europe with Russia inside, I think.
Next question. If not, I have a question. I think you gave us a very good recount of how the European Union came into being, beginning with the coal and steel community, 1951. Now, I think
I skipped most of the passages because this wasn't
right. But my question is the following: do you think it is? What do you think are the prospects of Asia following in the same way?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think a modicum of integration will be very useful. the same path, I don't think, I mean, this evolution is the product of European history. And as I said, Asia has evolved in a very different ways. So at the moment, I don't see the Asian countries moving towards the same path. But what is important, I think that was mostly the point, one of the 2 points I made in the speech, is that the Asian countries try to forget the past grievances and look to the future and to increasing cooperation in all fields, not just the economic, because this is not enough to prevent disasters from happening. So I certainly see, hopefully, a high degree of cooperation. I don't see a movement towards an integrated Asia along the political lines which we are trying to follow. That seems to me much more difficult at this stage.
Yes. No, but even that took a long time. I mean, the political integration of Europe.
It took 50 years.
Yeah, it took a very, very long time.
It took 50 years. Yeah.
Right.
It took 50 years.
You think it's possible? You think it's possible for Asia in 50 years' time?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. Not along the same lines.
Right. Okay.
But no, I might be wrong.
Questions, Frank?
50 years, but how many more years do you think it'll be before Europe becomes the equivalent of the United States of America? You have the United States of Europe acting as one unit. I mean, you're moving in that direction, but you're not there yet.
No, we're not there. I'm not sure we ever get there completely. I mean, there are several different thoughts on this in Europe, as you might expect. But I think we have done a good job so far, because it is very difficult. I mean, it was difficult at 6. It's increasingly difficult. It was increasingly difficult at 15. It's very difficult at 27. Mm-hmm. The peoples of Europe are very different from each other. United States is a different reality. I mean, they are more or less a homogeneous population, but we are not. Mm-hmm. I mean, you cross the Alps, and from Italy you go to France, to Switzerland, to Austria. We are all very different. So, of course, in our case, the process is much, much more complicated. Mm-hmm. And what we have achieved so far, I think, is a relatively great result. Mm-hmm. How far we will go towards complete political union, I can't say. I'm not sure we'll ever get to that point where you really act as just one country. Mm. Although a lot of people would like to see that happening, but really I'm not that sure.
Mm. See, last Sunday's New York Times Magazine had a long article about the future of the world, and that article saw three main forces in the world in the future: the United States, Europe, and East Asia. And they saw Russia as almost disappearing in terms of influence and trying to get closer and closer to Europe so as to remain relevant.
You want my view on that? Well, as far as Europe, United States, and Asia being the three major players, I mean, this is already happening. I think it's not. I mean, it's not in the distant future. It's already there. Of course, the three major players are not homogeneous, because the United States move as one player, as one country. Mm-hmm. We don't. Neither does Asia. I mean, but on the fact that these are the three pillars, I entirely agree. It is already like that. About Russia, disappearing from a stage like that as a world power, I don't know. You think that will happen?
Well, the Russian population seems to be getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, well, still a large country. It's still a large country.
My name is Yang Yumen. I'm a geographer from this university. I would like to get back to one of your comments in which you seem to, I think, get your finger on the right issue. That is Euro-Asia, if you want to get it further, just emphasizing economics is just not enough. I think by the implication of that statement is that we really have to move very actively on other fronts, such as culture, cultural exchange, arts, and so on. Now, the question I want to pose to you is what do you think is the present state of affairs as far as non-economic issues are concerned between Europe and Asia. Mind you that we are talking about 2/3 of the world. If we are thinking the world as a tripolar world, 1/3 in Europe, 1/3 in Asia, and 1/3 in North America, we are dealing with the greater part of humanity.
Well, you say non-economic cooperation, then I see two sectors. One is the political, the other one is the cultural. In both fields, in my view, the situation is not that good. In the political field, I mean, I've said before, we are in a very, very preliminary stage. In the cultural field, I see an imbalance. I mean, if you go to an American prestigious university or a European prestigious university, you will see a lot of Asian students. While if you set foot in one Asian prestigious university, how many Europeans will you see? Not many. And that, I think, is a problem for us, in the sense that clearly Asian countries are making a massive investment in educating their future leadership, taking the best, wherever it is, in their own countries and in the West. We are not doing that. And since we will have to deal with Asia by necessity, the better we know it, the more well-equipped we are to deal with it. We are not doing that. So answering your question, in the political field, we're starting discussing these things, but still discussing. I mean, talking but not doing things. In the cultural sector, there is this imbalance, which is worrying to me as a European. So there is an exchange, but it's not as much as we would like to see, and it's very unbalanced. Also, in terms of knowledge of the cultural of the other partner. I mean, my impression is that the knowledge of European culture in Asia is much more is deeper than the knowledge of Asian culture that you have in Europe. So there is an imbalance there, which I think should be addressed, that we should address.
Questions on the floor? Yes, please do it.
We're Thomas, from Stanford University in psychology. You talked about the political and the economic spheres in Europe. I was wondering about the causality. At one point, you seemed to say that the prosperity in Europe stems from the improved political connections within Europe. And there are times when it seems as if it's the other way around. That is, there was a time when at least those of us in the Caribbean looking on at Europe, trying to get more favorable treatment for sugar or for some other Caribbean product, felt that the political integration in Europe was a desperate attempt by European countries to stay close to the influential regions of the economic life. That is, a waning economic force in Europe, at least as experienced by individual countries, led them to the table to talk about more, better, stronger political integration. So it seemed sometimes, at least for some periods of history, that it's the economics that's driving the push for political integration rather than political integration leading to economic prosperity. I was wondering if you had a...
Well, it goes both ways. The idea in Europe after the war, I mean, the people I mentioned before, they clearly, in their mind, they had a political object. I mean, this was a federalist, the manifesto which I mentioned was a federalist program. Federalist is by definition, you want to move towards a political object. Doing it immediately was quite difficult. So they started working on the economic integration, not just cooperation, but integration. It means you had to give up, to pool sovereignty in certain fields in order to proceed. And this has then brought about a situation when the connections were become so strict that we started discussing again the political file, I mean the political the political integration. So the two things have moved together. I mean, the object has been, at least in the minds of most of the people who started this process, was political from the beginning. But they knew that they couldn't just say, okay, let's start with political integration. Actually, they started. They tried to do that, and they failed. The clear example is they tried to create a European army, European defense, and that failed. It didn't work. So they proceeded with the economic. I mean, they realized that they couldn't start from the beginning with that, and then they moved to the next stage and then to the next stage.
Any other questions?
That was 1954. European, 1954. There was the failure of the
Army.
European army. Yeah.
Well, if not, then let us thank the Consul General again. And there's a reception afterwards. Right? I'll let you do it.
Thank you, Mr. Deputies and Professor Lau. It is indeed our great honor to have invited Mr. Deputies to the Chinese University. To show our appreciation, Professor Lau will now present a souvenir to Mr. Deputies. Gentlemen, please. It is a photo of the beautiful campus of the Chinese University. We hope that this Mr. Deputies will remember today's memorable occasion and come to visit us again in the future. Thank you, gentlemen.